Hey everyone, this is the tutorial for imitating Thom Mayne for the last couple of weeks of the semester. The first thing that we want to do is have our final couch information in Rhino, so that includes the surfaces, the intersections, the points, all of that stuff. And I want to go ahead and do a file save as, and save it as something new so that we don't overwrite what we have done so far this semester. I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder really quick for myself. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. The next thing that I'm going to want to do is make a copy of all of this stuff. So making sure that all of my layers are unlocked, I'm going to go ahead and also make sure the gumball tool is pressed. The gumball tool basically allows this set of arrows to appear that you can drag left, right, every which way. If you turn it off, you'll notice it disappears, so just make sure it's activated. Also make sure that Smart Track and O-Snap are both active, and that all of these things that I have checked off are checked off. So if we have our gumball tool selected, we can hit Alt, A-L-T on our keyboard, and we can just click and drag to make a copy. Alternatively, you can simply type in the copy command and click on one point and click on another point to get it to the new direction. But we're going to go ahead and lock this original set of information simply because if we mess up somewhere throughout this tutorial or as you're kind of creating your final images, we can always have a backup that we can come back to. So we're going to go ahead and look up drawings by Thom Mayne. Jethro, you had sent me a specific one that we're going to look at. So we're going to go ahead and Google it real quick. And I'm going to go ahead and save that to my computer. So if I do File, Save Image As, I can do Main, Reference. And what I can do now in Rhino is right-click to create a new layer and call it Picture. And we're actually going to bring that image into the Rhino workspace. So making sure that that layer is active, I'm going to type in Picture. And I'm just going to place that reference that we just did. It's pretty much the same thing as the rectangle tool, which I think we've discussed in a couple of other tutorials. You just click on one corner and then click on the other one. And of course, that's going to bring it into our workspace. So I'm going to also lock that one. I'm going to rotate it. Whoops. I'm going to use this blue arc to rotate it and then lock it in place. And now instead of flipping back and forth between Google and our Rhino, we can just have it right here and we can just kind of scroll to the side. So you'll notice that what Thom Mayne does with a lot of his drawings, especially ones like this, is the extrusion of several components of the house. So this is the 2468 house that we talked about during class. Basically, this is every component of the house. So this is the staircase, this is some, the other kind of this curved staircase, these are probably some kind of wall or chimney. So he's actually kind of decomposing the entire project and making that an entire composition. So we want to look at our project in a similar way. So we know that it's composed of 1, 2, 3, whoops. 1, 2, 3. There's 6 different surfaces on here. We also have a grid that we use to build it up and a bunch of points and intersecting lines, and the list goes on and on. Basically, you just want to determine what you think is the most important to include in this final drawing. Also, keep in mind that Thom Mayne has a lot of line work going on in the background, and we're going to do something pretty similar to that. So looking at this one and this one, I don't think that we need our labels. I think it would be nice to keep the surfaces obviously in these lines and probably these intersecting lines, but I don't think the points are going to help us out very much, so I'm going to hide those as well. I'm going to go ahead and select all of this and then re-show those layers and type in hide. And since we don't need any of this stuff anymore, we can just go ahead and delete that. Alternatively, you can click on the points layer and control click on the labels layer, right click, select objects, and then delete those. I don't like to do this unless I know exactly what's in my document because I accidentally delete stuff that I might need. So typically I'll just do it on a per base instance like I just did there. And all we have to do is type in show to get it back. So if you click on your blue surface and it selects the entire thing like this, we're going to go ahead and type in explode. And what that's going to do is take this entire poly surface and break it down into individual pieces like so. first thing I'm going to do is hide all of the layers except for my surface layer and probably this image layer. And I'm going to do that by control clicking this one to deselect it and hitting the light bulb to just isolate these things. So now what we can do is just start to kind of drag the pieces out like so. If you hold down Shift, you can add objects to your selection. So that's what we're going to do here. And we're basically just going to break this entire thing down and use those as our quote-unquote building components. You can rotate these, you can mirror them, you can scale them, you can do whatever you'd like. For right now, I think in order to do that, I need to create a couple of copies of it. So again, holding down Alt and clicking and dragging the arrow will create a copy. Alternatively, you can hit copy and just bring it down the line like so. So you'll see that this staircase is a different size than this staircase, which is a different size than these walls. And I think it would be really good to start to play with a lot of this stuff using the gumball tool that we just used. So if I select this middle set and type in scale, what I can do is click on one of these points and simply type in a value, like let's say 0.75. That'll make the entire selection 75% of its normal size. Whereas if I do like 5, it's going to get 5 times bigger. So I'm going to make mine a little bit bigger. Let's say like 1.5. I think that's looking pretty good. And then to shake up this set, I'm going to go ahead and rotate everything. So again, if I select it and I have the gumball tools activated, I can go ahead and rotate it using this ARC tool. If you hold down Shift, that'll lock it to 90-degree angles, and you're more than welcome to do that, or just kind of do your own thing until something looks right in your model. And I'm going to go ahead and flip all of these instances as well. So the ones that lay flat like this, I'm going to make them vertical, and the ones that were vertical, I'm going to go ahead and make flat. And again, what we're having you do for the rest of the semester is pretty subjective. If you don't want to do the same things that I'm doing, by all means, feel free to deviate from those. But I think this is looking pretty good. We have a pretty good set of fragments, quote unquote, to start to arrange throughout the composition. I'm going to go ahead and move those off to the side a little bit. And if I type in show, it's going to bring up, oops, I have to actually show the layers over here. And now we have a couple more pieces of information. I'm going to go ahead and switch into an isometric view simply because the perspective is starting to give me some troubles. The way that I'm going to do that is by hitting this drop down, hitting set view, isometric, and then you can just pick any one of these, but it'll basically lock it into a calculated view or the isometric drawings that we've been doing throughout the semester. So I think that Mayne does a pretty interesting job of incorporating conventional drawings into these images. And what I mean by that is this is a staircase from above. So it's a very technical thing in the midst of all of this abstraction going on in the overall composition. And I think the best thing to probably do that on would be the grid. So I have a couple options here. Since I'm now in an isometric view, I should be able to line this up perfectly and just select all of those objects. Alternatively, I can select the grid layer stuff by right-clicking on grid and hitting select objects. And I think that I want to do a more curved one like this, but I also want to do something similar to what's going on over here and give this kind of sense of organization to the left side of the drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this over a little bit and then Alt click and drag to make a copy of it. So we'll go ahead and make this one, we'll keep this one the same, and then this one we will kind of bend and skew. So if I select this and go into my top view, I'm in rendered viewport, I'm going to go ahead and type in bend, and making sure that this project button is hit down here. I'm going to go ahead and click on one end, and you can kind of click anywhere along this. Clicking at different places will give you different results. So if I make this axis really short, obviously the deflection is going to be very different than what we would do like this. So on this one, for example, it's a lot more controlled and even, whereas this one is kind of a more chaotic thing. So you can decide what you'd like to do with that. What I'm going to do is something more like this. I kind of like the way that it begins to scrunch down here. And I can also run that command several times if I'm not completely happy with what it looks like. So I'm going to do something like this. Stretch it a little bit further. And you can use the gumball tool to start to kind of scale it in one direction or scale it in another direction. The world is your oyster, as they say. So I'm going to go ahead and scrunch it up a little bit this way, and I'm going to do a little bit more bending to the left, like so. And I think I'm pretty happy with that shape. This one we're going to come back to in a little bit, but just make sure that we separate those from the remaining information as well. So if I go back into my parallel view, we have two things remaining. We have this whole set of line work, and we also have this kind of topographic grid up top. I'm going to go ahead and right click my intersections layer and select all of those. And I'm going to go ahead and drag these off to the side to separate it from all of these purple lines. From here, you can kind of do the same thing. You can either stretch it or elongate it. You can start to play with its rotation. You can start to bend it as well if you so desire. You'll notice that when I hover over a certain part of this, it's going to snap to a point up here. That's because our project is still turned on. So if we turn that off, you'll see that we're able to snap directly onto some of these objects. And you can just kind of play around with this until you find something that you like. For me, I'm going to go ahead and rotate it like 90 degrees. I'm going to stretch it out this way, stretch it up downward a little bit like this, maybe even start to bring it back like so. And you can make as many copies of these as you want, so you can kind of play around with everything compositionally. But once I get them into a place that I like, it kind of looks like a roller coaster track, I'm going to go ahead and type in group to make sure that I don't have to individually click all of those lines later. And I'm going to do the same thing with these over here. So that's a pretty basic introduction to the gumball commands. What we want to do for this, what I want to point out with this Thom Mayne drawing is that, again, we have these kind of technical drawings overlaid on top of this really sophisticated collage. I'm going to go ahead and do a make 2D of a composition. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use the object itself as an underlay for the entire workspace. And I think that'll make more sense once I kind of get further along in this tutorial. Basically what I want to do is kind of go into a side view. And actually, let's go ahead and do a make 2D of this really quick. I'm going to rotate around to a point that I think is interesting for this purple stuff. I think something like this starts to get a really interesting density and starts to show the curvature of the couch. Is there a better angle? That's up to you. I think this one's actually looking kind of nice. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these while I'm not too far away from it. And I think this would be a pretty interesting underlay. So I'm going to go ahead and do make 2D. And what that'll do when we go into our top view, of course, is make the line work from all of those lines. And now we can very easily imagine it being, if we stretch it out this way and we stretch it out this way, it can start to become some kind of compositional element that runs through the entire drawing. So I think this is looking pretty interesting. I want to make sure that all of the line work is below all of the surfaces that we have. And the way we're going to check that is by going into our right view, or a side view. It doesn't have to be the right one. And basically ensuring that we drag it pretty far down like so. We also know that these two grids are line work, so we want those to be kind of far down. And the same thing with these over here. Basically, we want all of that line work to simply be below all of the solid surfaces that we're modeling up here. So while I have those selected, I'm going to go ahead and hide it for a second. You'll notice that there's not an inherent logic to a lot of this stuff. Sometimes he unfolds it in a particular way, but that was more so in the isometric diagrams that I showed you during a lecture maybe 2 months ago. I can get the exact lecture to you if you need it. But we're going to look at all of these surfaces in a top view. And we're going to go ahead and switch to a rendered view, because you'll notice, of course, that Thom Mayne uses a lot of shadow in this, and we want to start playing with those shadows as early as possible. And the way that we are going to get that is by typing in sun and turning that on, and we can start to see the definition of a lot of shapes a little bit better. So you can choose to use the ground plane in Rhino. The way that we can toggle that on and off is by going to the render settings, by right-clicking this button. I'm gonna go ahead and turn mine off. And I'm gonna go back into my parallel view. I like having custom ground planes simply because it offers a little bit more control, and the ground plane that Rhino does by default isn't that great all the time. So I'm gonna go ahead and make a new layer called ground plane. And I'm going to go to the lowest point that I have in my entire workspace. So I'm going to type show to bring all of this stuff back. And we know that these purple things are on the bottom layer. So I'm going to go ahead and type in rectangle, making sure that I'm on my ground plane layer and clicking on one of those points. Make sure that project is turned off. And basically just clicking and dragging so that it is bigger than the entire set of components that we have. And I'm going to go ahead and move it down a little bit below this purple simply because we want it to be able to cast shadows. So if we do something like that, now we can type in planar SRF. And when we hit enter, you'll notice that it takes that boundary and turns it into a surface that sunlight can project onto. So if we go back to our top view, you'll notice that it got very white all of a sudden. I'm going to go ahead and lock that bottom layer. And it's very whitewashed, so I'm going to right click on my render settings yet again, and I'm going to turn the sunlight skylight intensity down from 1 to like 0.25 maybe. You can even turn the skylight off altogether. I like to have it simply because it kind of deflects light around a little bit better throughout the workspace. But if your computer is not very good at processing stuff, you probably want to turn it off, and we can get pretty good results with just the sun as well. Especially in a situation like this where the shadows are very harsh, and we'll be able to line those up and adjust the opacity in Illustrator. So this is looking pretty interesting. One thing that I probably want to do is type in unlock, and that's going to unlock this and also our one back here. I'm going to go ahead and lock our original set of chair information. And it's kind of difficult to tell the difference between the ground plane and all of these surfaces. So if I select my ground plane and go to Properties, Material, click this drop down and do Use New Material. I'm going to do Custom, and I'm going to go ahead and make the color, I don't know, 100, 100, 100. And now we can see these surfaces a lot clearer, and the shadows that they project a lot clearer as well. So I'm going to go ahead and type in Lock. From here, you have a decision to make. Either you can leave them floating in space like we have going up here, or you can make sure that all of the objects are touching the ground plane like is happening in this image. I'm going to go ahead and make sure they're all touching the ground plane like so, but I'm going to go ahead and leave the line work staggered below all of this stuff still, and I'll explain why later on in the tutorial. But if I go into a right view, I'm going to go ahead and type in line and hit project. And what project does is basically treats your screen as a two-dimensional plane. So if I typed in the move command without project turned on, it could click anywhere along this axis of the workspace and anywhere along this line, and you're not going to get the alignments that we've already set up so far in this file. So what I'm going to do is select all of my objects and type in move, again making sure that project is turned on, clicking the bottom of it and making sure it's in line with that line that we just drew. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that for all of the objects. If you have a really thin flat object like this, that's perfectly fine. We'll touch these up a little bit later, and same with these strictly vertical moments as well. And the way I'm redoing the command so quickly is if I type in move and then I select my object to move and move it down, once that command is over, if I right click, it'll rerun the same command that I just ran. So that's how I'm speeding through it so quickly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that for the remaining pieces. Again, we had 3 sets of couch things going, and we wanna make sure that all of them are along the same plane. And again, I'll explain why that's important a little bit later in this tutorial. So for situations like these two where there's not really a point that would want to touch the ground, you could do it at this corner. If you don't want to, you can of course rotate it as such and bring it down to that line. I'm going to go ahead and just do it on the corner because I think it would look pretty interesting. And the last thing that I should mention with this stuff is if you hold down Shift while you are using the move command, it'll snap it to a 90-degree angle, very similar to what the gumball tool does. So once I make sure everything is flat on this, I'm gonna go ahead and go back into my parallel view. And we aren't gonna be able to see much depth with things like this that are completely flat. So when I have it selected, I'm gonna do the same thing for all these thin walls as well. So boom, boom. Actually, I might just do it for all of them. Go ahead and, oops, looks like I missed one. I'll go back into my right view real quick. Type and move, bring that bad boy down. Go ahead and do a file save. It could get kind of weird here. Basically, I'm going to select all of my surfaces, and we want to give them a thickness. So if we look at what Thom Mayne is doing in this drawing that you sent me, Jethro, there's actually a thickness to each of these walls, and we want to emulate that because it'll give us some more interesting shadows. So once I have all of these selected, I'm going to go ahead and type in offset SRF. And you'll notice that a bunch of arrows pop up. Basically what that's telling me is that it's going to extrude that surface in that direction. So I want to make sure all of them are extruding upwards, especially these ones that are down on the ground plane. And whoops. So that should take care of all of those. I don't think anything is pointing down. And then for these ones up here, it doesn't matter too much. If you want to make them all pointing left, you're certainly more than welcome to, but I'm not going to because it doesn't really matter too much. And now it's going to ask us for a distance. If I type in, I'm going to say 2 and see what happens. If you hit 2, enter, and then hit enter again, it'll offset all of those surfaces by 2 units. So I think those are pretty nice. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Control Z or Edit Undo, and I'm actually going to offset some of them at different distances than others. So I have a total of 18 surfaces. I'll just do 3 different distances. So if I select 6 of them, 3, 4, 5, 6, I'll do offset surface, make sure all of them are pointing up, and I'm going to go ahead and type in 2, hit enter, enter. I'm going to go ahead and hide those. I'm going to go ahead and click 6 more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Offset SRF. Make sure these flat ones are pointing upwards. I'm going to offset this one by, let's say, 6. Then I'm going to hide those. Finally, I can select these final 6 and do offset. Whoops, I accidentally deleted them. Offset SRF, and I'm going to do it by, let's say, 12 after I make sure that this one's flipping upwards and this one is as well. So if I type in 12, it's going to give us some pretty interesting shapes that we can start to play with. So once I hit show, it'll bring up all the stuff that we previously hid. And now I'm going to go into my top view and start to arrange things. So if I go ahead and zoom in like so, kind of get it to a rough dimension of what you want the image to look like. So you'll notice that this is a more horizontal drawing. The original JPEG is actually rotated 90 degrees upwards, but because our Rhino viewport is a rectangle like this, we're just going to do the drawing sideways effectively. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in something like this. And if I go to this drop down and do set view named views, I'm going to call this one Mayne by clicking on this view. And what that's going to do is save this view. So if I zoom out and then scroll over to the right, I can always go back to this down here that says Mayne. Alternatively, you can go to named views and just double click on the view. And of course, that's going to bring us back to where we were before. So at this point, I'm going to start basically making sure that nothing's colliding. So you can see that this one and this one are colliding from above. And I'm going to start rearranging all of these elements. So I'm going to fast forward, but effectively all I'm doing is clicking and dragging with the gumball tool and rotating things and basically making sure that the composition is something that I'm happy with. But before I do that, I need to bring this ground plane upward. So if I go back to my parallel view and unlock everything, and again, I go back to my original data and lock that. This I want to bring up to the level of this line that we established for everything. So I'm going to go to my right view, type in move, and making sure that project is still enabled. We're going to simply click and drag upwards like so. And once we go back into our view called Mayne, we'll notice that all those shadows are now touching the bases of all of these shapes. So I'm going to relock that. And again, I'm just going to be rotating and moving these things with gumball and also kind of stretching them in random directions just until I get a composition that I like, making sure that I'm sticking in my main view and I'm not panning or rotating or anything like that. All right, so once you have them compositionally how you'd like them, you have another decision to make. Either you can keep it in isometric view like this. I was just doing the isometric view so that I could work in a little bit more calculated workspace, if you will. But you'll notice that Thom Mayne, he actually does things in perspective where this stuff is reaching out to the side and this one's reaching out the other way. So in order to replicate that, I'm going to go ahead and go to Set View Perspective. And basically just get like as close to the top as I can, as similar to a plan view as possible. And again, you don't have to do this. You could stay in that calculated view. If you do want to make it more dynamic while you're in a perspective view, you can type in Dolly Zoom, Dolly like Dolly Parton, and simply click and drag downwards. And you'll see that it's kind of like a vertigo effect where everything starts flying towards the screen. And once we have that in a place that we are happy with, we can go ahead and overwrite that other view that we had. And I'm going to go ahead and call this good. I like the look of this. I'm going to go to Set View, Named Views, Save, and I'm going to name it Main 2. So that way I'm not overwriting the other one and I can still go back to that one if this one doesn't work out the way that I want it to. So from here, we need to get that line weights, that line work back in the conversation. And I'm going to do that by going to my parallel view. Basically, I'm going to, what's the best way to do this? I'm going to go ahead and make this larger, my main 2 view, like so. I'm going to scrunch it down a little bit, actually. So this part's kind of interesting. If you have this view set like so, it's ballpark what we are going to have the final thing look like. I'm just going to work on this parallel view, even though it's a little bit smaller. And if I go like this, whoops, I just want to select my purple stuff, and I bring it upwards, like something like this. I still want to keep it below this cutting plane. I can actually just go into this view and start to skew it like so, something like that looks really nice. Bring it down maybe a little bit, or scrunch it up a little bit like that. Again, this is just kind of a compositional thing, but I never alter this viewport. I simply want to, actually I'm gonna go ahead and unlock this ground plane yet again. I'm gonna hide it for now. So that way I can see kind of the overall set of everything, but I'm only gonna operate within this workspace. We also wanna get rid of this line right here that we use to align everything. But basically what I'm going to do is bring this line work up in this view. I think that I'm going to drag it off to the side. I'm just going to work on this one first. So if I bring it back into this vicinity, you'll notice that it pops up over here. So I'm going to go ahead and start stretching it and manipulating it. And I think it would belong best over here, doing something like this. And again, this is all subjective and you can do whatever you would like. But basically what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of minutes is rearranging all of this line work and making sure that it looks compositionally correct in a lot of this. So here is some more fast forward music. Okay, so once we think we have everything compositionally where it should be, we're going to go ahead and type in show. And that's going to bring back this kind of ground plane that we had going before. I'm going to go ahead and full screen this main 2 layer. And instead of locking this individually, I'm just going to go ahead and lock the ground plane like so. And I'm just going to lock this just so I don't have to keep relocking it. And go back to our set Thom Mayne view. So now you'll notice if I hit Control A, it's going to select all the line work that we can't see because it's below. But first I want to mess around with the sun settings.
So if I go ahead and hit here, depending on where you're at in the world, it might be a good idea. It might not. I usually like to do it in NB, Omaha NB, simply because a lot of the projects that you're going to do in your education pertain to a site specific to like maybe South Dakota or the Midwest. And of course, the sun patterns in something like Omaha NB are going to be actual replications of what the project will be doing. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust these like so until I get some nice depth and I start to see some really cool shadows. I'm going to do mine this way. I think something like that. Get a lot of shadows, that would be good. Something like that. And I think I like the look of that. So once I have this, make sure that you are in Mayne 2. Go ahead and right click on your render settings. Again, my skylight's turned off and I just have the sun layer turned on. Something that I might do real quick is unlock my ground plane layer. And now that we've kind of organized all of this stuff, I want to make sure that it's actually an all white material. So I'm going to change the color of it to white like so. And now we should just get a lot of these really harsh shadows around the outside when we render it. So if I right click on my render settings, you can make these settings whatever you'd like. I think the viewport and 72 DPI and draft quality should be just fine. I'm going to go ahead and bump mine up a little bit just so that my YouTube thumbnail doesn't look awful. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit render. So you'll notice that when you don't have a skylight on, it takes not a lot of time at all to load up. So I'm going to beef mine up just a tad bit more. I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you have a desktop because I have a bit more computing power. And again, I have that thumbnail to make. I'm going to go ahead and do it. So I think that's looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and save the image as a PNG. That is vitally important. And I am going to name it Mayne Render Underlay 1, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And now I can exit out of this and I can do a make 2D of this that we can align to everything in Illustrator. So if I zoom out and I go ahead and select everything except for that ground plane, I can go back to my set view Mayne 2 and I'm going to go ahead and do make 2D. First, I'm going to save. I recommend that you do the same because we have a lot of complex geometries that might get kind of weird. I'm going to hit make 2D. You can choose to group the output. You can choose to do the scene silhouette, so on and so forth. I'm going to leave all of these unchecked. And I'm also going to make sure, please, please, please make sure that maintain source layers is checked off, not any of the other things. And once I hit OK, it's going to take a second to process, so give it some breathing room. And I will rejoin you when the make 2D is done, unless it takes 3.46 seconds, at which point I will keep going. So I'm going to go back into a top view. Just to get rid of that perspectival stuff. And if I look at my line work in a shaded view, we're going to notice that it looks pretty dang good. I don't think it really dropped anything in the entire document, maybe some line work here, but I think this is looking pretty good. One last thing I want to mention before we completely get out of Rhino is the scale 1D command. So the gumball tool, if this doesn't work, like clicking and dragging the edges to scale it or holding down shift to scale it proportionally, you can do what's called scale 1D. And basically if you click on two ends of an object like this and this, you can stretch it in one direction or stretch it in another. And I think it would probably be the most useful in a situation like this where you're trying to stretch up things upward like this, especially the couch surface. But now that I have my line work done, I am going to go ahead and look back at my Thom Mayne image to see what else I'm missing. I think for the most part, once we get the shadow in there, it's going to look pretty dang good. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of this and type in distance. And what that's going to allow me to do is once I hit project, I'm going to click near the edge of one part of the image and hold down shift and click near another edge of the project. And it's going to tell me that it's 593 inches large. Ideally, the images that you produce for Garrett and I will be between 12 by 12 and 24 by 24. So what I can do is type in, I can either do the conversion based on this 593 inches. I'm going to go ahead and type in line and basically just say like 2 feet, which is the apostrophe key on your keyboard, and hit enter. And basically I'm going to type in scale and bring everything ballpark down to about that size. So that was our line, so I think something like that will be good. Now what I can do is basically select all of that, making sure that I'm in my top view, go to File, Export Selected, export it as an Illustrator file, and we'll name it Mayne LW or line work. And now the scale is going to pop up. Since we just scaled this down, I'm going to make sure that 1 inch in the model equals 1 inch in Illustrator. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So we will kick it over to Illustrator right now. Okay, so once we're in Illustrator, we can do File, Open, and we're just going to go ahead and open up the line work file that we just made, which will be right here. And I think that a good ratio for this project is probably going to be maybe 24 by 12. I think that 2 to 1 is a good ratio, something like that. But it'll probably depend on the line work. So if I hit Control A, if you don't see any of your line work, you'll notice that it's way over here. If it's not even like on the art space, go ahead and type Control A, Control C, or edit copy. If you hit Control 0, that'll center the artboard in your page. And you can just do edit, paste, and that'll center it on the page for you. If this doesn't pop up in separate layers, you need to make sure that the layers were maintained. Go to this triple drop down right here in the layers tab and hit paste remembers layers. Make sure that that is checked off. If you don't have this panel, I usually use Essentials Classic, and I can activate that by going Window, Workspace, Essentials Classic. Still, if you don't have some of the things that I have, like links, you simply click the links tab still in this window section, and it'll bring that right up for you. So once I have this line work here, I'm going to I'm gonna go ahead and just delete this stuff over here. And I'm gonna select all of this by hitting Control A. And if I shift click and drag on this line work, if you don't shift click, it's going to scrunch everything. You do not want that. If you shift click, it'll scale everything proportionally. And I just want to kind of center everything on my page like so. Maybe even make these purple lines start to bleed off the page a little bit. This is basically how you want your composition to read. I want mine to read something like this. I think I'm pretty happy with how this looks. So if you have any white layers, the lines are going to show up white. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control A again and double click on this stroke button right here and make sure that all of the line work is black for now. And I'm just going to make mine 0.5. I'm going to be using this as a reference. And speaking of references, I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer and name it Reference Image. And I'm going to bring in, I spelled that wrong, reference. I'm having troubles, folks. Reference image. And once I drag that to the bottom over here, I can simply go to File, Place, and bring in that same image that we had before, which was right here. So now we're going to be able to literally draw colors from this thing and look specifically at what Thom Mayne is doing. So we're going to go ahead and make a new layer and call it Shadows or Render Underlay. Take your pick. I'm going to name mine Render Underlay. And I'm going to lock all of the other layers except for that one. And again, making sure that I have that selected, I'm going to do File, Place. And I am going to drop in that image that we just rendered. And that'll be this one. From here, it's going to be kind of a guessing game. Basically, you want to make sure that the shadows line up exactly with the stuff below. Please take the time to actually line it up because these are final drawings and we want them to be as crisp as possible. I'm going to go ahead and put the opacity of this image down to like 75% just so I can see the edges a bit better. And the way that I align things is by looking at the furthest right point on my line work, which looks like it's going to be this edge right here. And basically making sure that that point is exact and then going over to my left side and seeing what the furthest left point is doing. So I know that this corner corresponds with this corner, so I need to make it a little bit smaller, like so. And I can use the arrow keys to nudge it down slightly. And now when I go back to that same point over here, we'll see that it's a little bit offset, so I'm going to go ahead and scale it down this way. And then I just keep going back left and right until it is perfectly aligned. If you used a low DPI, you're not going to get it perfect probably, but if you used a high DPI, you should be able to get it pretty stellar. So I'm going to do that. We can see down here that the shadow is bleeding out a little bit, so I actually do need to make it very slightly bigger. And that shadow pretty much disappears like that, and it blinds pretty well like that. And I think overall it's looking okay. You should spend the time to fine tune it really well, but since I'm not, I want to get through this tutorial for the sake of you all, I'm not going to do that. So Mayne uses some pretty harsh shadows. I think 75% is about what he uses, because you can still see the line work of what's happening underneath, whereas like at 100%, it's a little bit too harsh. You can play around with this opacity, but I think that 75 is probably going to be our best bet. So if we click on this image and go into our links panel, again, that's window links, you can click on this down here and that'll show the location of the object. And now that I'm looking at this render background, I was going to go into Photoshop and just isolate all of these shadows, but I think it might be better if we just re-render this in Rhino. So if I go back to my set view Mayne 2, I am going to go into a rendered view. I'm going to make this like a really starkly different color by going to material, and let's go ahead and change the color to like a lime green, as so. Because we have the skylight turned off, these shadows are still going to remain black, and we'll be able to get rid of this green background. So if I go ahead and re-render this very quickly, I can save it again as a PNG, and I'm just going to overwrite this one that we saved before. Be careful when you do that. It's not always the most appropriate situation. And when we go back into Illustrator, you'll notice it's going to say some links are missing or modified in the links panel. Would you like to update them? We're going to hit yes. And now you'll notice that we have something much more manageable to Photoshop. So now if I click on this and hit on the location, I can right click on the image and open it up with Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and update it. You probably won't get that message, but basically what I can do now is hit this magic wand tool, and if the tolerance is set pretty low, if you have the skylight, you're going to want to put the tolerance up higher, but because it should just be this one kind of green color in the background, I should just be able to hit my magic wand, click on it once, right click and hit select similar. You'll notice that it didn't select this initially, and I want to make sure that it's selecting all the instances of green. I'm simply going to hit delete. I'm not going to crop this because it's at a specific size in our Illustrator file. So if I go ahead and do file save, it should save it as a PNG. When I go into Illustrator, you got it. It's going to do the automatic update again. So it's still at 75% opacity, which I think is great. I am going to go ahead and turn this off for now. And I want to start building up the drawing like Thom Mayne does. So what I'm going to do is I'm either going to make a solid background for this. He has it on this kind of parchment paper. I'm actually going to go to Google and type in parchment paper texture. And if I go to images, I'm going to go to tools and make sure that I'm searching for large images only and look for something very subtle that also does not have a watermark on it. So I think something like this looks kind of nice. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'll call it Mayne Underlay. And once I create a new layer and call it Parchment, I'm going to drag it to the very bottom, and I'm going to follow that same file place process that we've done before. I'm going to go Downloads and simply place that into this file. And you'll notice that it's way bigger than our artboard, so that's good. If it ends up rotated like this, go ahead and hover over a corner of it until that double arrow pops up. And if you hold down Shift, just like in Rhino, it'll snap it to a 90-degree angle. And I'm just going to scale that down to our artboard size, which was, I think, 24 by 12. So I'm going to go ahead and go up here, make sure that constrain width and height proportions is turned off. And then go 24 by 12. Now if I do edit copy, delete it, hit Control-0 and paste it, it should put it on that bottom layer centered perfectly on the page. If you want to adjust the size of your artboard, deselect everything and go to Document, Setup, Edit Artboards, and then from here you can either adjust it manually or you can type in the values up here. So I think this is looking pretty good. I want to turn on my render underlay real quick and just make sure nothing is too insane. he uses this kind of teal in some of his projects, and I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. Either you can re-render it in Rhino yet again. Again, this is a very back and forth conversation between all of your programs, or you can do it in Illustrator. And I'm going to show you the Illustrator version just because I think it's a good tool for everyone to know. If I turn off all of my line work underneath and just leave these kind of surfaces on, if I select this and go to Object, Live Paint, Make, I can go to the Shape Builder tool and hit the Paint bucket, or alternatively just hit K on your keyboard. And I can use the eyedropper tool or hit I on your keyboard to literally select the color of that thing. And when I go back to my Live Paint bucket, I can fill it in with that color. Any of the areas that show up as boundaried in red, you can go ahead and click on those. But for the sake of consistency, I think I'm going to do mine in Rhino. So this is one way that you can do it if you don't want to re-render in Rhino. But I think the Rhino way is probably a little bit quicker. Excuse me. I'm hitting Control Z to make sure that these are all separate lines again, which they are. And what I can do is, actually before I go back into Rhino, I'm going to get this color. So if I go to the eyedropper tool and click on something like this, I can double click on it and get its RGB code. So if you write that down, I'm going to do the same. 31 right here, and then 134, and then 133. What I can do once I get into Rhino is I'm going to select this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. And I think that'll look pretty nice compositionally, maybe even this one. Yeah, that'll be good. I'm going to make it a new material called Use New Material, Custom, and we'll call it Thom Teal. Is that how you spell teal? Is it T-E-A-L? I'm not too sure. I'm going to hit this color icon, and you'll notice that this is also RGB. So if I go 31, 134, and 133, or whatever color you picked up, go ahead and hit OK. And you'll notice that it's going to change to that color. The rest of the stuff is actually kind of this weirder red. I'm going to write down the color of that as well by using the eyedropper tool. And that is 98, 74, 73. And while I'm in Illustrator, I'm just going to check it one last time. Yeah, I think he just uses those two colors. You can pick whatever colors you'd like. I'm just going to use this as a reference image to get the same color scheme. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these other ones by shift clicking and adding to my selection. And I'm going to make a new material, custom. We're going to name it Thom Red. And I'm going to go back to my color settings and make it the same as what they were in Illustrator. So I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And I'm going to re-render it. This should be second nature at this point in the semester. I'm going to go ahead and save it. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite this, hit yes. Going to go ahead and open it up in Photoshop. Hello. Whoops. Computer's freaking out. File open. Open up that thing that we just did. Select the green. Select similar. If it starts to select some of this teal, just lower the tolerance. Go ahead and hit delete. And I'm going to hit Control S or File Save. And now once we go back into Illustrator, it's going to ask us to update. We're going to say, heck yeah, my dude. Where's my Illustrator at? You alive? Okay. And you'll notice that once we turn that layer back on, we are cooking with peanut oil. So I think this is looking pretty good. You can adjust the opacity of the render underlay. You can adjust the opacity of the shadows. You can play around with a lot of different things. If you would like, I actually don't know. I don't think I can do much more with that. I think it's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and lock all of my layers except for this line work underneath, which would be these 4 layers, I believe. If you want to create some kind of contrast between all of this stuff, so like this one, we want to be the thinnest probably. I'm just going to click on this layer and make it 0.25 inches. I'm going to select the next layer up, which is probably this grid. And you'll notice that I didn't group those very properly in Rhino, so sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and leave those as they are. Maybe make them 0.375 inches. That looks good. And then for these bad boys, I'm going to go ahead and select those. I can either leave them at 0.5. I can make them that 0.375. If this is still too distracting for you, I would recommend making it like even a white. I think would be perfectly fine. You can, again, just play around with whatever feels right to you. And if this isn't complex enough for you, you should go back into Rhino and just basically follow those same steps where you populate it more with moments like this and re-render and all of that jazz. But I think for the sakes of this tutorial, I've given you all the tools that you may need. I'm gonna go ahead and do this as like 175. And I think I like the look of that pretty well. Basically, I want to make sure that all of my line work is below my render layer. So my render underlay, I want to be at the, actually I don't want it to be at the top. I want it to, the surfaces to be at the very top. And then I want my render underlay to be just below that. And that way you saw right here that all of that line work starts to shrink down to the bottom layer. And beyond that, I don't think that any of the layer stuff matters other than having our parchment paper on the very bottom. So this stuff is those lines. That stuff should be fine. This is kind of just a pain in my side. I'm not too big of a fan of this one. You have a couple of options if you want to get rid of line work. You can either hide everything but that layer and simply delete it like so, or you can go back into Rhino and kind of re-export all of the line work. I like to just really quickly do it in Illustrator. If you hold Shift, you deselect of your selection, and that actually was not as painful as I thought it was going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and hide all this other stuff, and I think it is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do from here is, it seemed a little bit brighter on over here. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock my render underlay, and what I'm going to do is go back into Photoshop and do a file save as. I'm going to name it render underlay 1 black. And what I can do is hit Control U or image adjustments, hue and saturation. And I'm just going to go ahead and bump the lightness down to -100 so I can make it pitch black. And I'm going to do, again, a file save as. I don't know what just happened. I'm going to overwrite the black version of it, hit OK. And now I'm going to make a new layer called render underlay black. And lock all of my layers except that one, do file place, and place that file. If you don't want to realign everything, I'm actually going to go ahead and unlock my render underlay, and I'm going to do edit, copy, edit, paste in place, and then simply drag that up to this layer. So it didn't look like it did anything, but there's actually a copy of them on both of these layers now. So you'll notice that that one has a layer, or an image, and that one has an image as well. And what I'm going to simply do is hide my render underlay, so I just have render underlay black, go to links, and hit this little relink icon, and replace it with the black ones. It's the same dimensions. I'm going to go ahead and bump this down to like maybe 25%, or I guess we won't really know until we see that other render underlay. I think that starts to look a little bit better. So basically we just have like a black silhouette on the top of this entire thing. And I can play around with the setting on that until it looks right. I think this is probably the sweet spot. So if there's anything else you want to know about some of this stuff, please reach out. The last thing I'll show you really quickly, I'm not going to do it in this tutorial, but if you don't want to like re-export any line work, I would make a new layer called hand drawn LW or line weight, and you can go to the pen tool right here and simply click in Illustrator or something like that, whatever line you want to have. And once you hit the selection tool or V on your keyboard, you can click off of that, and then you notice that of course this is a line, a vector-based line, and you can adjust the thickness of it and the color of it, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to have it in here, but if you feel like your drawing is lacking anything and you want to kind of fill in some of this space, by all means do so. The last thing we want to do is do a file save. Where are you at? File save as. And I'm going to go ahead and do in Adobe PDF, do not do an Illustrator file. It has to be a PDF, and I would name it ARCH221, last name, final drawing, iteration 01. And then, of course, every subsequent file that you make will do another save as. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Make sure this is checked, and this is checked, and this is checked. And then you can have the view PDF after saving if you'd like. I'm going to do it just so I can show you an Acrobat real quick. And I think I like the look of this quite a bit. So if you have any other questions, please reach out and ask us. We are here to help you out. And we know this is a lot of information. The work that everyone's been producing so far has been really good. So we want to keep that trend going. So until next time, have fun, please.